For decades, the Indian school system has relied on a heavy-handed approach. Millions of students sitting in massive halls, tasked with one primary goal: memorize as much content as humanly possible and write it down. But reciting paragraphs from a textbook doesn't translate to actual comprehension. The modern workforce needs problem solvers and critical thinkers, while the legacy education system was perfectly calibrated to produce exceptional memorizers. The curriculum also heavily favored English. Fluency in English became the ultimate measure of a student's intelligence, which systematically pushed native Indian languages to the margins of the classroom. The result is an academic pressure cooker. Generations of students have been forced through a rigid, uniform pipeline where a single memory-based exam determines their entire future. Now, the Central Board of Secondary Education, the authority governing thousands of Indian schools, is rolling out a massive overhaul. Stemming from the National Education Policy of 2020 and the 2023 Curriculum Framework, this is their official response to those systemic failures. This is a complete teardown of the old methods. The board is actively redesigning how students learn, what languages they are required to speak, and how their intelligence is evaluated. India is abandoning its colonial-era educational scaffolding. In its place, the country is building a flexible, competency-based framework designed specifically for the 21st century economy. The most visible change starts in Class 6 with the rollout of a mandatory 3-language rule. This flowchart maps out what the CBSE calls the R1, R2, and R3 language selection formula. It gives students choices, but within a very specific set of structural constraints. R1 is your primary language. This is the bucket where you need the highest level of proficiency, and it will typically be the language you've grown up speaking, your mother tongue, or a dominant regional language. Then comes the strict requirement. Out of the 3 languages you choose across all buckets, at least 2 must be native Indian languages. You could choose Hindi and Tamil, or Marathi and Gujarati, but 2 is the absolute minimum. This mandate immediately sparked a controversy. Parents and critics looked at the math and asked a very pointed question: is the government trying to eliminate English from schools? The short answer is no. English is not being removed from the classroom. What it is definitively losing is its mandatory dominant status. English will now be categorized as an optional, non-Indian language. It sits on the exact same tier as French, German, or Japanese. If you want to study it for your 3rd slot, you can, but you are no longer required to take it to graduate. By shifting English to an optional status, the system decenters its colonial legacy. It prioritizes indigenous cultural identity first, while still leaving the door open for students who want to maintain global mobility. But linguistic identity is only half the equation. The other half is technological survival. The new framework heavily pushes Indian schools toward Industry 4.0 skills. The board is embedding advanced topics directly into the core curriculum. Schools will now focus heavily on artificial intelligence, coding, data literacy, and practical vocational training. There is a strict macroeconomic logic here. India has a massive demographic dividend of young people entering the workforce. To compete as a global knowledge economy, the country must train this generation in these exact digital skills. However, teaching a kid to code is completely useless if the end-of-year board exams still only test their ability to memorize definitions. So the exams themselves are changing. The board is stripping away traditional, direct theory questions. You will no longer see a prompt simply asking a student to recite Newton's law verbatim. This split-screen graphic illustrates the shift. Instead of basic recall, students will face case-based questions and application-based multiple-choice options. They will be forced to take core concepts and figure out how they apply to messy, real-world scenarios. An education system is only as effective as its testing methods. By redesigning the exams, the CBSE officially transitions the Indian student from a passive memorizer into an active problem solver. Finally, to address the crippling academic pressure, the framework introduces a 2-tier learning system specifically for mathematics and science. This diagram shows how the tracks branch out. All students take a mandatory standard foundation class covering the core concepts, but only those with specific aptitude or interest in the subject will opt into the advanced track. This provides immediate cognitive and psychological relief. Students can finally tailor their education to fit their actual passions. If a student wants to pursue art or commerce, they don't have to be forced through the same advanced calculus grinder as a future engineer. But this brings us to the final, unavoidable complication. There is a massive gap between a revolutionary policy written on paper and actually executing it in the real world. Implementing dual teaching tracks, recruiting fluent language teachers for diverse combinations, and building advanced AI pedagogical infrastructure is incredibly difficult. While wealthy urban centers might adapt quickly, it creates a massive logistical hurdle for rural schools. The CBSE framework drafts a brilliant new blueprint for the modern student. The true test of this policy, however, will depend entirely on India's ability to fund and execute it across a massively unequal landscape.